Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked with special guest Eric Hammersley live and on stage last time from HyperConnect. Today, we're talking about risk assessment with special guest Adam Brennick, Director of Security, Risk, and Compliance at Cockroach Labs. But before we get to that, we have some beers. What are we drinking today, Adam?
Well, Kane, today we are drinking the Squatch Pirate Juicy Haze IPA. That's No Lie Brew House in Spokane, Washington.
Okay, I've been to
That's right.
Spokane. It's got a pirate on. It's a Sasquatch. This must be a Pacific Northwest beer, right, Tom?
It is. Yep. As he mentioned, it's out of Spokane. I always like to hear Kane's take on the labels because that's where he really dives in deep on the labels, whether he likes them or not. So, what's your thought on the label?
Is it firing a hawk out of the cannon? Is that what that's supposed to be?
Yeah, that's exactly.
I am getting good at identifying vegetables. There we go.
Is a hop a vegetable? I'm not sure.
It's green. I think food eats it, right?
Yeah, that's right. This has some passion fruit in it, so it should have a little sweetness to it for a hazy. So this promises a bit of balance, Kane. So I'm kind of interested in where you fall on it. So I say we crack these.
I don't know. This Sasquatch has got its feet pretty close to the beer. I'm not sure how this is going to work out, but we'll give it a go. Oh, it hissed at me. Oh, wow. That has an odor. Damn.
I think it smells amazing.
Yeah, just opening the can and hissing at me, it has an odor. But there we go. We've got a beer pour on stage.
I think the term is aroma.
I've heard the term aroma. It's
got a
hazy.
Nose to it.
I'm not sure if that's coming through on camera, but
it's got a wonderful head on top of it. So,
well, Tom, if nothing else, I've learned how to pour beer from you. So my next career as being a bartender, I will be set. Because
look at how pretty that is.
Career progression from CISO to bartender. I can barely see this.
That almost has an orange juice look to it.
You're not wrong.
It's so thick and hazy.
You know, I've had mimosas in this color. I think I had a mimosa at the airport lounge yesterday, actually, that was in this exact color shade. So, but it smelled better. Ooh.
Well, you definitely get
there's some fruity
citrus.
in there.
I almost get like a nutty smell to it as well, which is odd.
Yeah, it got like a citrus, like a orange peel maybe to it.
Yeah.
And you can smell the hops.
Oh, there's the mango.
Well.
Yeah. Yep.
You can smell mango.
Yeah, of course it. Yeah, I can smell not mango. I'm sorry, not mango. Passion fruit.
Okay, it's been a while since I've eaten one of those.
I think that's the sweet smell. All right, I'm going to taste this thing.
Sort of Swedish smelling. All right, yeah, we'll all have a go, and Adam, you can let us know how it is.
Tom, I get what you're saying. That it's like almost got like a peanut butter smell to it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's unusual. It even has it on the backside on the flavor profile a little bit. It's just slightly nutty, which I can tell you I've never had something like this that's got a nutty flavor.
It's kind of tart.
Yeah, it's a little tart.
Yeah. It reads sweet on the nose, but it is tart on the palate.
Yeah, it's a little sweet. The nutty part is really throwing me off.
Actually,
if I'm being honest.
It is coming through on the back end. There's like cashew. Like cashews or mixed nuts. Not pecan, not sweet. It is a damn.
So the balance is there. I mean, it's not overpoweringly hoppy, so there's a nice balance to it. I wouldn't say it begs me to take another drink like some of them do.
But also, I'll say I'm not like full tilt grimacing about this one either. I think loyal viewers will know. Usually, if I have a feeling about a beer, which I often do, usually you get a reaction out of me. This one is reaction free, so actually, that's a promising sign for my review. As always,
Adam, how do you feel about it?
I like it. It's nice. I'm partial to IPA, specifically hazy. I'm from Maine originally, so the New England hazy style IPA is right up my wheelhouse. So I like it. I like it doesn't drink too sweet. I'm not a huge fan of sweet alcohol, but I'm a fan of it. I enjoy it. So great selection.
Fantastic. Well, I think with that, we can probably move on to our easy questions, kind of for introductory topics for our audience that might not know this topic as well as you, Adam. So what we're going to do these just rapid fire. Tell me, what is a risk assessment process?
Sure. I'll try to go not Webster's here and add my own little flavor to it, but from a risk assessment process standpoint, really you want to evaluate business objectives for an organization to get an understanding, make sure everything's aligned with the strategy of the business. Try to identify threats to those business objectives, evaluate the impact and likelihood of those threats to calculate a risk score, whatever that happens to be. Determine your prioritization and response to those risks you've identified. And then after that point, it's maintenance, it's monitoring, it's reviewing, education, and communication of those risks in the organization.
Okay, and I love that you're describing it as a business process, not some technology thing.
Yeah, nope. Yeah. I was going to say, you said some things there I think are really important. One is you align it to the business, which so many people think of it as an IT exercise, and it's not. The other thing is you kind of went over it quickly, but you indicated that there is some scoring mechanism associated with risk assessment. And the reason it's okay to kind of go over it quickly is because it's not specific, or it's specific to a given business or business type. Your appetite for risk is different in one business than it is in another. So you're going to develop your own risk scoring methodology. The important thing is it's a thoughtful approach, and it takes into consideration how it impacts your business. So good points.
Cool. So second rapid fire question for you, Adam. How does that risk assessment process or processes, how do they support compliance programs like SOC 2 or PCI or so on?
Yeah, absolutely. So largely any compliance framework is going to have a risk assessment component to it. SOC 2, your common criteria 3, the global controls, and ISO 27001, PCI requirement 12. So when you're looking at really any compliance framework, there's a risk assessment component to it. So developing business as usual processes around risk assessments, make sure that you can execute these in maintaining compliance, align with your compliance objectives and strategies. And then fundamentally, like I said, those business as usual activities where it's not something where it's like, oh, I got to remember to do my risk assessment for SOC 2. It becomes something that's a business process.
Business as usual. I really love that phrase.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should all accept that this is now part of everybody's normal, everyday, yearly requirements, right? We're not doing this because just a compliance framework says so anymore. We're doing this because it's the best practice, and compliance frameworks are finally caught up.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point to put on there, Tom. So final rapid fire question for you, Adam, before we get into the detail-oriented questions where I really want to get your perspective. Tell our viewers what the role of a risk register is in enterprise risk management, which some might have heard called ERM.
Yeah, absolutely. So your risk register, it's that mechanism that tracks and controls all your risks in your organization. And fundamentally, I view that as the source of truth for the risk profile of the company. It gives data to the company to prioritize activities. It creates organizational transparency about risks and what's occurring, what could disrupt the business objectives of the company. And fundamentally, it's a tool really for decision making, right, in the organization. If the risk register is available, it's transparent, and people can have access to it, they can use that to make business decisions in the organization as opposed to gut feelings or just kind of thinking this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, you said some key words there. The idea that it's transparent, I think, is paramount. The idea that we are working in businesses anymore where people up and down the organization don't understand risk as a totality, those days are gone. We should understand throughout the business what risks we're dealing with, so we can make better money decisions, but also better executive and execution decisions on what we go after to mitigate that risk. So yeah, it also, maybe the one point I would add is it adds a clear line of ownership. So a risk register should add clear ownership to every risk. That way, you know where to go to find out a given set of objectives around that risk. So
yeah, and realistically, the CISO does not own, as a matter of fact, every risk in the business, as some would have you believe. Eric, Adam, I want to poke onto the harder topics, the more detailed topics. And the specific thing I'm thinking of is I was at Gartner's IT Expo Symposium in Orlando, Florida, where I watched Gartner analyst after Gartner analyst talk about the connection between audits and between risk assessments and between how we talk about risk assessments. And so that's top of mind as I'm thinking about today. And let's talk about how risk assessments really support those compliance audits. How do you conduct risk assessments in an organization to ensure that they're actually meeting the standards of your compliance audit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great and really unique question because every organization is different. I think, we've kind of established that initially, is that this risk assessment process isn't one size fits all. And depending on the organization, what type of business you're in, the size, there's so many different characteristics, right, that can fundamentally drive that risk assessment. I think first and foremost, it's starting the process at the level of maturity of your company. So you don't want to start a risk assessment process that's enormous and really, really complex from the start. I would say it's good to try to find a more lightweight risk assessment process. And there's a lot of information available on the internet. You could scour if you want to. Something that I did personally when I was starting at Cockroach Labs is use the COBIT Risk IT framework, which is a smaller, more lightweight risk assessment process. Now, that isn't an enterprise risk management because it's more focused on IT, but taking that foundation, that framework, and expanding that out into different areas like finance and marketing was a way for me to start and lay the groundwork that we could build on a risk assessment process that we could mature. So I think fundamentally is taking the requirements from, say, SOC 2. I generally lean on SOC 2 and ISO because those are kind of the first compliance. It's rarely I see someone have nothing and be like, oh, I'm going to go for PCI DSS right out of the box, unless they absolutely have to there. So developing that risk assessment strategy on something lightweight, having that foundation, and having it mapped to the criteria of the audits that you're subject to really get you on that path to be able to build on top of that foundation and build that really sturdy structure of risk assessment processes in the organization. Because I've seen, someone go, oh, we need to do SOC 2, we need to do risk assessments. And they're like, let's go, right out of the box all the way there. And I don't think that's always the wisest strategy. I think you can find something that's a little more lightweight to start and really build off of that.
Yeah, and I love that your message is tailored to the maturity of a business. I, like you, have seen businesses try to over-engineer their risk assessment process. And at small startups with first-time CISOs, that inevitably results in kind of a comedy of errors, really. Tom, I'm sure you've seen similar things happen.
Oh, 100%. I think that's a paramount point to I'd say even lean into, is what maybe the one place where you're going to have some alignment across organizational size is you're going to get your executive team aligned. But what that executive team looks like is very different in organizations. The level of understanding of risk throughout the business in a larger organization is completely different than it is in a smaller organization where you have somebody who's really close to daily decisions. So, building a structure that accounts for that, depending on the size and maturity of the organization, I think is a great point.
So let's take that and now move up scale to the larger organizations. And again, thinking of some of the Gartner analysts that I spoke with last week in Orlando, they talked about the checkbox mentality. And I know that some of our loyal viewers have heard us talk about checkbox mentality before as it comes to compliance and risk. So Adam, based on your experience, what's it take to make a risk assessments not just that checkbox activity for passing an audit, but actually a core business as usual process, as you said earlier?
Yeah, I mean, it's great because I've seen it start as that, right? Like we've seen, you're a small company, startup, you got pushed into SOC 2, you're doing a risk assessment. So it's fire up a Google sheet, let's jot some things down in there and pass it to the auditor, and they'll give us a thumbs up and we'll all move on with our life. I think it starts with determining the value for the compliance team, the GRC team, whoever it is that's going to be doing that. Often it can be an engineering leader, right? That kind of kicks these things off, or a program manager. So fundamentally, you're starting is, what are your goals out of it? What are you trying to accomplish out of it? If you start and say it's checkbox compliance, it's never a way to do anything. But if you can break that mindset and say, what are my goals out of this? What do I want to do? Where do I see issues in the company? Where do I want to drive change in the company? And the risk assessment process, maintaining these risks can be a real driver for you in instituting organizational change. So I think if you're able to come into it and determine your own goals from the start of developing this risk assessment process in your organization, it'll drive decision making. And then secondly, you'll be more passionate about it. Like, you'll be invested in it, as opposed to, hey, this is just something we have to do for ISO and we're just going to do it and mail it in. Because starting there and making it a compliance checkbox activity, something I heard one time, that I didn't coin this phrase, but there's nothing more permanent than a temporary firewall rule. If you develop a checkbox compliance activity, that will be a checkbox compliance activity for a very long time in your organization. So, if you start it from a stance of, I have a goal of executing this and I'm going to push on it, I think you'll see that value, and you'll shed that, checkboxy mindset of it, and you can develop a mature, really valuable risk assessment process in the organization.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. The two things that I always think about when I start building risk out is ownership and urgency. So if I can create ownership and I can create urgency in an organization, then I usually can create a lasting sort of best practice risk process, but it takes time. Ownership is pretty easy to understand, right? Somebody owns each individual risk, and there's a way to track it. So that usually means a good tool. The urgency piece usually comes back to a dollar sign. So if you can put a dollar sign to risk, you get ownership to pay attention and truly invest in the idea that they need to mitigate risk in a meaningful way. If you can't tie it back to that, you're really missing the language of the business, and that's probably going to give you some trouble.
Yeah, and I think that the thing we're really talking about here is this is a business process. This isn't an IT or a cybersecurity or a information security process. This isn't a checkbox thing. But I'm wondering, Adam, about how you've succeeded in the past about getting business owners to actually engage in risk management, because often what's their motivation, like, or particularly if they don't come from a language of risk, which I find especially true in startups, is culturally missing. So what strategies have you found that have been effective, or maybe if you want to take it the other way, what strategies have been ineffective for getting business owners to take responsibility, as Tom said, for their risks? And how do you ensure that they remain actively engaged in managing and monitoring those risks over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start just kind of high level, like ineffective, what I've seen. One strategy I've seen that can be ineffective is lack of context, engaging with stakeholders without the appropriate context. So throwing a meeting on someone's calendar to say, hey, I want to cover risks with you. That's scary, right? Mm-hmm. That can be alarming. Someone kind of can go into that meeting a little bit guarded up, right? And saying like, oh, I'm in trouble here, right? I don't understand. So I've seen it occur in organizations where there isn't appropriate context set around engaging with stakeholders in risk management, risk assessments. So lack of that I've seen as a fundamental way that these things can blow up in your face and cause a lot of consternation in an organization.
And I'm sure the other way of doing it poorly would be like have the famous catch-up meeting and put that on somebody's calendar and say, so we're going to talk about risk now. Because most people find risk to be upsetting to talk about. So if that's what doesn't work, Adam, how do you move past that and get people to engage? And not just as a one-time event also, because you talked about this. This has to be a continuum. How do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing I do is spend time with risk owners, not fundamentally talking about risk assessments to start. Right? Especially if it's someone who I haven't engaged with. So reaching out to them for maybe a sync up or a coffee chat, right? Something just to get to know them a little bit better. So if I don't fully understand, where their role in the organization or what they're doing, I get a little bit of understanding about who they are. They understand who I am, what we're doing here. So I like to get to know whoever I'm working with, at the risk management level first. Then when we get into the discussions about risk management, risk ownership, I want to make sure that we're aligned on what the business objectives are. because I might have misinterpreted a business objective, right? We could work in different functions in the organization where our leadership has determined business objectives or interpreted them in a slightly different way. So I want to make sure that we set the context that this was driven, these risk assessment, these risk management processes were built on these business objectives and these interpretation of the business objectives. So I make sure there's firm alignment between me and the business owners that I'm working with. Next is these are kind of a little bit of a buzzword, right? But like cross-functional collaboration between the teams. This isn't me walking up to you and saying you have a risk and then I walk away. Right? It's us working together cross-functionally to ensure that we're collaborating and addressing everything we need to do. Tom, as you said, ownership, right, is huge, important, and making sure that someone understands what risk ownership means. And we're working collaboratively on this to reduce the risk profile of the company, to make sure that we have a strong company that either, has a great stock price and we all continue to make money. If it's pre-IPO, right, we get to that stage where we can all find our own exit strategy. But I want to make sure that it's a collaborative experience between the risk owners and the GRC function in the organization. And then last but not least, really just try to, at a macro level, build like a really supportive like risk culture in the organization. Like make it a culture of risk management, understanding and working together to reduce risk. So that's a tough one to do. It's easy for me to say like, build a risk culture in your organization because it's a sentence. But I think the upstream things that I mentioned there really allows you to have the opportunity to build that supportive risk culture in the organization and really make it a collaborative strategy across business owners and the GRC team, and not this is yours, go deal with it.
Yeah, and Tom, what I'm really hearing out of Adam here is not a lot of math. Like I'm not hearing this is a big technical spreadsheet exercise. This is an exercise that people do with other people, right?
That's right. That's exactly the point I was going to make is you've really kind of taken away the complexity of it by just reminding everybody that this is a human activity. And truly, if you can get humans to understand that risk is something you manage, it's not something you walk away or hide from. It's something that you understand, so we all are more successful down the road. I think that's really important. And I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about almost the different layers of human interaction that you build into it, really to get to this end goal of having a managed risk program. You have coffee chats and individual like get to know yous, and then you have more structured meetings, and then you talk to a little bit about sort of the ownership piece and how you get people to run with it once they own it. And then finally, hey, at this macro level, we build this culture. And, I haven't seen that very successfully done, where people up and down the organization talk about risk in a way that makes you go, oh, that's a risk culture. But I don't think that should dissuade us from saying that's a goal we should go after. And certainly as we build the maturity in the organization, they'll start to talk that narrative, a little more naturally. So no, that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I will shout out a couple industries where I have seen that risk culture. One is manufacturing, because of risks to people, especially, and the other is construction. Although they talk about it as safety, but what they really do mean is the language of risk. Those are the brightest spots. I think the one that's been dragged, kicking and screaming at times, into risk management is finance. That's just like they like taking risks. They don't necessarily like managing their risks. But if you're enjoying this conversation on YouTube, ring the bell to get notifications about my quest to find literally any beer that's drinkable, or subscribe to this in your podcast app of choice to make this part of your routine. So Adam, I want to move on to, we've talked about risk assessments. Let's move on to what happens after that. Let's talk about risk treatments and maybe a little bit on education, because you seem to be a person-focused guy, which I kind of like. When you're assigning those risk treatment plans across the organization, how do you teach people? How do you educate stakeholders on the concept of risk assessment and acceptance, particularly when they might have trouble understanding the long-term implications of accepting a risk?
Sure. I think we haven't got too deep into risk scoring, right, and that risk quantification where we say this has some value attached to the risk, and what can that be? I always try to attach it to a dollar value. I think people understand dollars and cents well. They can understand dollar value versus this will cause X amount of reputational harm, because it can be subjective, right? And they say, well, I don't think it's that bad of, big of a deal, someone there. So as much as I can, anytime we're ranking and scoring risks, and I don't want to bore the audience too much with getting into, in-depth risk quantification metrics and things like that, but try to attach, the impact of a risk to something that's easily understood and easily digestible to someone who doesn't live and breathe risk management every day, like some of us. Then next step is, don't be afraid to show how the sausage is made, right? Bring them in and show them how you develop this risk score. Don't just say, yeah, we did the vending machine where I started my finger here and put it up here and it's very high, right? You've, in your organization, if you've developed a model to score these, don't be afraid to show folks and let them know and get feedback from them, right? They say, well, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me a bit more? Feel free to dive in and be open-minded on your end, right? Nothing we do is immutable. It can be changed based off of feedback we have there. So I try to be, we said transparency before, is very transparent about how we scored this risk, how we calculated what the risk is. And then the next step there is to get into that treatment plan. So I want to educate risk owners, what does risk acceptance mean? Really, I think that's fundamentally a goal of like a GRC team, even up to maybe a CISO, right? Is educating stakeholders on what risk acceptance actually means here. So, something that we've heard, and I try not to make it sound like too scary, but if when presenting a risk to someone and saying, hey, if this risk was exploited by a threat actor and it was in Hacker News and on CNN and all over the news, and your name was the person they said, hey, they said this wasn't important enough, like, how would that feel? How would that impact you personally? It could be big, could be bad. And like I said, we try to not make it from like a scary standpoint, but we do want to educate folks that if this does happen, right, like try to think of it from that human aspect. Like, how would it impact you on a personal level if you were the person that everyone looked to and said this occurred because you said it was fine, or you accepted it. And like I said, not trying to put the ball totally in their court and saying this is 100% on you, but trying to get them to think in that space of, I am responsible for this and I don't want this to happen. So giving that person all the information about what the impact is, how that could impact them and the organization, I think really helps to drive that education. And then also that they have a real commitment, right, to being involved in the process there. So that's how I try to treat it, and how to take it there is explaining it in a concrete example they can understand, show them how we got to this, and it wasn't just throwing dart at a dartboard, and then try to let them know, right, like fundamentally, what does acceptance mean in the context of risk management.
Yeah, I love the idea that you're building sort of a common language around risk with your sort of risk owners, but also with the organization as a whole. So everybody understands when you talk about risk acceptance, they understand the ramifications of a word like that. Or when you talk about risk mitigation, they understand what mitigation means. A lot of these words have meaning outside of information security that may look a little different. So making sure everybody understands those are really smart. I can only imagine what a conversation looks like when you say, what would happen if that was your name in the paper, right? I think we have to be, we have to make sure they understand it in the context of the larger organization as a whole, which I'm sure you do, Adam. I just want, for the benefit of our listeners, I want them to understand that when you have those types of discussions, you have to make sure you walk people through to a clear line of lineage that says this is the organization as a whole. This is your piece in your corner of it that you own. And this is why something that impacts the large organization also impacts you. You're the decision maker here that it flows through. But no, all around, I think that the point of having a common narrative around risk is really important.
Yeah, and some of that came up at that Gartner show I was at last week, where they were the Gartner analysts were talking about the value of an executive being willing to stand up in front of the TV cameras or be willing to stand up in front of Capitol Hill and say, look, this is the decision we made. This is the information that we had. We all agreed as a team that this was the best decision. And I think the example they gave was on patch cycle. And they said, to manage a risk, we're going to do patches every 90 days. Well, if you get breached 98 days after a patch is released, clearly something happened internally and you have to look inside of the organization. But if you get breached 42 days, your patch cycle is 90 days. Even though a breach occurred, that executive has the confidence to say, look, we made this decision, we made it collaboratively, we understood the risk, we are accepting the problem, we may adjust our processes moving forward, rather than the common problem where if there's not enough transparency in that decision-making process, or if there's not enough executive alignment where everybody agrees, like, yeah, we're all going to stand up and say this is how we did it. The one thing I'd add to that is having it in writing sure helps. Like if you've got a risk acceptance form where somebody signs it off, that sure does help people be motivated to make conscientious decisions rather than going, yeah, it's fine. But I do like your approach, Adam. I think that's really good.
Yeah, if your name was in the paper, obviously it's a little tongue in cheek there. We don't make it quite as scary, but we definitely want to have that ownership right in the organization and making sure people understand their role in the process, fundamentally. So totally that. And like I said, we don't go that intense with it, but we do like to sometime ingest, right?
For sure.
With the little nudge.
Yeah. Hey, a little fear goes a long way too. So
absolutely.
Well, I want to go back to something you said earlier in the conversation as well, where you were talking about how organizations get into compliance and maybe they're doing their first SOC 2 or their first ISO, and I hope that they're not doing PCI out of the gate or high trust out of the gate because ouch. But that's something that's also within your remit. And I want to understand if these aren't just a checkbox activity, if these compliance reports actually do have value that you're trying to communicate, how are you working to enhance the credibility and transparency in your compliance reports? And are there any specific controls or frameworks that you found that are really effective in building trust with your external stakeholders?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great question because we all hate doing questionnaires. I don't want to speak for everyone, but I feel like that
we all hate doing
questionnaires. I feel like I can say that with strong confidence. And the idea, right, of I'll kind of stick in SOC 2 ISO, framework because that's generally the groundwork. One of those two certifications of where you start from. The idea there is that either customer approaches you, I need this for us to do business with you, so you go down that road. And I think the most important thing when you're developing this is developing a control set out of the gate that's flexible enough to meet multiple standards, right? So not trying to author a control set strictly off the SOC 2 trust criteria. It's like, okay, well, it says this and the points of focus are A and B, so I'm going to write out my controls, directly off of that. I'm not going to say where, but I've seen instances where corporate policies are written with references to the SOC 2 trust criteria in the policy to circle back. So that clearly, gives the impression, right, that this may be a checkbox for them, right, where they're saying like, SOC 2 TCS says I do this and I'm going to write it in my policy, so it's directly referenced there. So building a control set that meets those requirements but is flexible enough and isn't rooted in just a standalone compliance framework, I think is a good first step. When we're talking about SOC 2 specifically, I really put a lot of importance in section 3, right? The narrative. That I think is where, if your SOC 2 report, there's misalignment between section 3 and your controls, for me, that's a huge red flag. Because if in your section 3 say it's like, yeah, we do monitoring and logging and we have a SIEM, and then I go down to the control set and there's no mention of that, how can I be sure that that's occurring? And I've seen that happen before. Mm-hmm. So I think fundamentally, when you're writing your compliance reports, put yourself in the reader seat if I was reading this, would I have trust in this organization that they're doing all the right things? So developing that flexible control set that isn't rooted in a singular framework, so it's flexible, it can be mapped across multiple frameworks and is rooted in your organization activities. When you're authoring, say, Section 3, right, that is aligned directly with your controls. And then from an ISO perspective, don't be afraid to share your statement of applicability. I think a lot of people say, here's my ISO certificate. That's enough. Share that statement of applicability. It has controls in there. It lets them know exactly what was in scope for the audit. And it can really go a long way for continuing that trust to saying, look, we have absolutely nothing to hide here. We're an open book. Like, I'd love to give you as much information up front so I don't have to fill out 700 questions in a spreadsheet. But those are fundamentally the way I look at these compliance report to help build trust and help reduce the sales cycle, right? Overall, fundamentally, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, all really good points. I mean, the days of information security being sort of a hidden part of the organization is well in the past. We are expected to be a part of the sales arm, and we know we're going to be engaged in the due diligence process of almost every deal that comes through. So we should be building our processes to be more seamless with the sales cycle. I think it's really smart to say, hey, don't be afraid to give these things. I think the point about SOC 2 is really important. I'm old enough to remember when SOC 2 was an internal document and not something you shared widely.
Yep.
But anymore, it's truly a sales document, and it should be looked at that way. So spending extra time on that document to make sure there's alignment, I think that's really, really smart. Making sure that it reads appropriately for your audience, I think, is also important. I've made changes for the last 3 years to the narrative that the organization puts, that the auditing organization puts out there, strictly because I want to make sure it's clear to our prospects as they review it. And then finally, we're starting to see the emergence of the trust center idea, right? And I think this is an important idea. I would like for certain compliance programs to more embrace it, because right now with FedRAMP, it's really hard to share just everything. But the reality is we have to find ways that our customers can come to us and get data that doesn't also put an additional burden on our teams to focus on things like questionnaires when we want to be focused on things like risk, right? So all good points.
Yeah, and if our viewers want to learn more about Tom's point on trust centers, I had a conversation with my friend Lisa. I think we were in either San Diego or Austin. I know we were at a show, but we'll see if we can get a link into the podcast, into YouTube, to where we talk about that. But Tom and Adam, as I was listening to both of you, I was thinking about a recent presentation that I gave with my friend Andrew from Appian, where we were talking about how compliance reports and his strategy really are supporting a go-to-market strategy, kind of both as you were saying. And I want to double click on this because this is an important point where I think some cybersecurity leaders are still struggling to figure out, or information security leaders or risk leaders trying to figure out, like, how do we align with sales? So how do you see that your compliance efforts are aligning with those go-to-market objectives? And how are you making sure that your compliance reporting is reducing friction with your prospective customers during that sales process?
Yeah, it's the fundamental question, right? And the kind of the mantra we've had is everyone is in sales, right? Everyone is in sales in the organization. So we kind of start from that approach. Like, we are in sales because what we do, obviously we care about, CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability of data. That's all important. But fundamentally, like, we want to sell the product. We're all in sales. So having that strong alignment with the go-to-market teams is, paramount, first and foremost. And it doesn't mean we need to meet, once a week or once a month. It can be quarterly, it can be semi-annually. But something we do is we make sure, we have strong engagement with go-to-market teams when we do planning. We do semi-annual planning. We make sure that we're working with the go-to-market teams to align on our compliance strategy, that we are driving in the right direction. And, we say, like, oh, hey, we want to go get ISO 27701 from privacy, and there's no appetite for that, or nobody cares about it, right? So why would we go down that road? We think it's important. GTM doesn't. We should probably sacrifice that unless there's, a legitimate business justification for it. And that's obviously critical, right? We have that kind of tight alignment from a go-to-market strategy. We want to understand the sales engine long term, right? If we're hearing rumblings about FedRAMP, we understand that that's a potentially 16 to 18-month process. Go-to-market might think it's just we decide to get FedRAMP and we just execute
you just snap
on
your
it.
fingers and twinkle your nose exactly. And it's done. Right, Tom?
And we've got it. Yeah, we just make the decision and it happens. So we want to understand like long-term roadmaps, right? And understand where the product is going, what verticals we're going to get into. And then we can align strategy at a long-term level for our compliance initiatives. And we can have alignment that we both understand that this, maybe take 2 years. So when do we start the sales engine? When do we start laying the groundwork for these compliance frameworks that we're going to tackle? And finally, last little bit here is from a trust center perspective, we want to get data from that trust center. If you have one, what are the documents that are being asked for most? What are the documents are being touched most? And how can we mature those internal processes there? We may have documents that are never accessed. Mm-hmm. We may have someone go to the trust center and always ask for the same document. So we want to continuously improve that forward-facing, access to these documents. So whatever data you can get from those sources, we try to make decisions on that posture to say, hey, everyone's asking for our business continuity results and we don't have it there. Probably time to put it in that trust portal to start reducing that friction.
Yeah, I love that you bring up that point because I remember my friend Lisa Hall of SafeBase in our conversation. She brought up those metrics and how that really helps justify investment in further cybersecurity programs and really showing the value to the business in a tangible way. Tom, anything you want to add in on this before we move to our beer reviews?
No, I absolutely love the idea that you're using metrics in terms of how the prospects and our current customers are performing their own due diligence against the items that you present. That's a wonderful way to sort of show value in the sales cycle, but also, I think to your point, Kayne, show value in terms of getting budget. So I'm going to take away that and learn from that myself. Again, you mentioned about how you align to markets. It's often the market decision that drives the compliance decision. So having that close alignment is important. I can tell you that as we moved into EU this year, I was caught up in that tailwind, right? I knew we were moving it. I knew GDPR would be important. What I didn't understand and what has become increasingly more important to me now is DORA. And how do we support our customers that have, kind of a tier 1 DORA requirement. But no, your alignment with sales is critical, and I think that point is well taken.
Fantastic. Well, at this point, we've had a really robust conversation. The thing we haven't done is we have not rated our beers. Longtime listeners, longtime viewers know I tend to leave mine out to say what oxidation is like, whereas Tom usually works his way through the first one and sometimes goes hunting for a second one. Who wants to go first for reviewing this one? Adam, you want to go on this one first, perhaps?
Sure. And I'll preface this with I'm partial to hazy IPAs, these types of beer. So take this, with a grain of salt, if you would. I'm going to go.
And it's a 10-point scale.
8.5.
Okay, there you go.
8.5 out of 10. I thought this was really nice, not too sweet. That kind of unique nuttiness on the palate was really enjoyable for me. I could see myself having, 3 or 4 of these and watching a football game. So 8.5 is mine. I liked it.
Fantastic. Tom, I know you have a feeling about IPAs. I'll go next. I've been sniffing this, and it smells like orange juice that's been left out for a bit. But that's not actually a terrible thing in my books. It's not. Some of the beers we've had on the show just they don't stand well. And now just say, actually, no, it still does have a little bit of that nutty flavor on the, and it's still a little tart, but it's not as terrible as some of the things where I've pulled a pace. I'm gonna break with tradition here. I'm gonna give this a 5. It is inoffensive. That's the best I'm gonna call it. It's inoffensive. You could maybe make a pitcher of mimosas out of this stuff. Maybe if you didn't have any champagne and you wanted to explain to your guests what you were doing. But it's fine. I think that's possibly the highest praise I've ever given a beer on the show. It's fine.
Wow.
It's not terrible.
And on this day, the 28th day of October of the year of our Lord 2024, Kayne gave a 5, which I think is remarkable. So we should mark that down as a milestone. But as you can see, I've drank quite a bit of this, so I've liked it. I will say it gets thinner as it oxidizes. So some of the really pull-in qualities of an IPA, I think, are starting to be lost on it. But it's also been sitting out now for 35 or 40 minutes. So as it oxidized, it also got boozier. So the alcohol was much more prevalent on the tongue. And then again, that nutty flavor was there. All that said, I would never take 40 minutes normally to drink one of these beers. So so that was a really complex way of saying, just drink it a little faster. I really liked it. Super balanced. I like things that are unique. So that nutty flavor is a unique thing to me, and I liked it. So yeah, I'll probably rate this like an 8.
Wow, 2.8.
So everybody liked this.
0.5, an 8, and a 5, dragging the numbers down. But that's usually what I do here, honestly, keeping it real. But that's all for today. If you think you know a beer I'd like, or if you've got a FedRAMP or a compliance question, please do send those in. Just DM us on LinkedIn or put them in the comments. With that, I really want to thank you for being on the show today, Adam, Tom. Always a pleasure, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.